Well, thank you very much, Beatrice, and thank you all for being here. It's a great privilege to be visiting Concepcion. This is my second visit to Latin America. This is the first time to Chile, but the last time was to Colombia. So it's a great honour to be here, and I'm very pleased to be able to exchange some ideas and hear about what you're all doing that is kind of connecting to the work that I've been doing with the Community Economies Collective for many years. And I've been very touched and amazed, I think, by all the ways in which the work of the Community Economies Collective resonates with so much of the activism around emergent economies and different ways of constructing worlds that are happening here in Latin America, and particularly we're going to hear about many in Chile, I think, today. So it's great to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. And excuse me if I'm a little bit out of it. It's the old jet lag still acting up at this time of day. Australia's like, I thought it wasn't. I didn't realise how far east Santiago and Chile is from Australia. 15 hours time difference really does screw the body around somewhat. So, but it's lovely to be in some other part of the southern hemisphere, seeing all the connections we have, particularly with vegetation. I look around and see the terrible eucalypt up there on the hills. I'm sorry about that. But a lot of other wonderful plants that I see that we share in common. So today I want to talk about this book, Take Back the Economy, an ethical guide for transforming our communities, which was published in 2013 by the University of Minnesota Press. But as Beatrice mentioned, it's just come out in the Spanish edition, translated by wonderful friends Juliana Flores and William Sanchez. And I have Arturo to thank for putting me in touch with these wonderful people. Juliana also translated A Post-Capitalist Politics into Spanish a few years ago. So the book's published in Colombia, and should have come up by now. There it is. And hopefully some pirated version of it will soon be circulating amongst the undergraduates here. We don't mind if it gets, copied. Any old way is fine, as far as I'm concerned. So this book was written with Jenny Cameron and Stephen Healy, my colleagues, and also we started this book in 2008. It took a long time to come to fruition. And we started it with Julie Graham, and Julie is my long-time dear colleague and friend who I published the other books with under the name of J.K. Gibson Graham as a joint persona. So I'll mention Julie a few times, but she was at the beginning of the conception of this book, and then we carried it on after she died in 2010. So it draws on our collective experience as geographers trained in political economy, and represents the most concerted attempt that we've made up till now to try and integrate more of an ecological sensibility into our rethinking of economy. And this book is written particularly for a popular audience, so it's wonderful to have people from community groups and experimental economic groups here, because you're very much the group that we were thinking of when we were writing this book, both students, teachers, communities, organisations, unions, associations, people who want to think and read together. And in a sense it's designed to provoke what I'll call ethical action for our times. It's informed by a range of theories, anti-essentialist political economy, theories of performativity that come out of feminism, and of new materialism. But hopefully it's written in a very accessible style, and the abstract theoretical language is avoided. So I'll try and avoid it in this lecture too, so to try and make it as easily understandable as possible. The book doesn't lay down any kind of blueprint for the future, but what it does is present a set of thinking practices or techniques for making other worlds possible. And some of these techniques are already being taken up by people to help them reflect on what's the terrain of possibility that they're situated in. So in the lecture, I want to present some of these thinking techniques, and I'll start with the technique of reframing, and then I'll move on to some of the simple tools that we've devised for reorienting ourselves towards ethical action for people and the planet. And I'll try and present a few examples of how people are taking back the economy in various ways, and I'm sure many of these examples will have connections to the kinds of things that you're already also doing in this region. So, first of all, the economy, stupid. One of the premises of this book is that our current understanding of what constitutes an economy is kind of standing in the way of responsibly facing the future and taking action to learn to live in our world in new ways, and ways that are less destructive of the very fabric of life as we have known it over the long interglacial summer, this long period of human settlement in which we've had relatively stable climate. So the take-back of the book's title is borrowed from the catch cry of feminist marches in the 1970s and 1980s, where people marched under the banner of "Take Back the Night," so that it was safe for women to walk the streets. So the take back that we're referring to is one that starts to demobilise the prevalent idea that the economy is the bottom line. It's that matter of fact, that matter of closed facts that adequately reflect reality and that operate together in known and predictable ways. This idea of the economy as a kind of machine that tells us what to do, usually a capitalist machine, which continues to be represented as the ultimate real. And here, I'm saying that it's still represented that way, despite the kind of guerrilla attacks by J.K. Gibson Graham for more than 16 years that I think are portrayed here on this cover of the Turkish translation of Take Back the Economy, our book that was originally written and published by Black Book Publishers in 1996. It was translated into Turkish, and this cover shows capitalism there as a robot, the machine of production voraciously eating up people, and the machine reaching out to take the earth and devour its gifts. And on the side, of course, we have little Julie and I throwing our little stones into the machine to try and stop it in some way, just like David tried to bring down Goliath in the Bible story. So this, we've been kind of throwing our metaphoric pebbles into capitalism, or the representation of capitalism, for over 20 years now. And the machine economy is still with us. But now I think it's pretty well accepted that this machinic vision is built out of models of economy that have become models for economic behaviour. Models moulded by metrics and technologies that perform national economies as large-scale economic experiments. This is an example of a model of the economy. It's the monetary national income analogue computer that was built in 1949, and it used water to model how money flowed around the United Kingdom economy, and when the government policies were supposed to step in and stop off one flow and enable it to flow in a different direction because it was investment or taxation flows or whatever. Interestingly, about 14 of these models were built, and this was made before the days of computers as we know it. So it was a form of a computer, but it was using these physical properties of water flow to try and model how economies worked, or how a national economy could work. Apparently, many of them now are sitting in the basements of economic departments in universities, although there's one at Melbourne University on display. Ford Motor Company bought one, and apparently the Central Bank of Guatemala has one as well. And there's a very entertaining YouTube that you can look at which demonstrates this, has this guy over here demonstrating how it works. So the kind of engineering hydraulic interactions that it is built around are those that have also been employed in both Keynesian and neoliberal economic doctrines. And as various scholars like Michel Calon and Donald Mackenzie and Timothy Mitchell and others have shown us, economic doctrines have been used all over the world, or these kinds of economic doctrines, these machinic ones, to construct national economies. So kind of simulations have become prescriptions in some ways. These scholars' work on the performativity of economics synchronises quite nicely with studies of biopower, the subject of governmentality studies. And biopower is that particular form of power that's exerted over and through the life of populations via things like health practices or sexual regulation or medical paradigms or education systems. And in this case, it's through economic policies related to particular machinic visions. So in the economic realm, according to many, we are all governed by neoliberal capitalist biopower. And certainly we're enrolled in the experimental apparatus of business as usual. So in the economy as a machine, in this imaginary, we, us economic subjects, are confined to limited roles and a very narrow set of motivations. So we're either interpolated as employees who want higher and higher wages. We're entrepreneurs or business owners who want more profits and lower costs, especially wages costs. We're consumers who seem to want more stuff for less payout. We're property owners who want higher and higher returns from private property investments. And we're investors who also want to gather private returns for financial investment. So these are the kind of subject positions that the machinic economy allows for. Up against this model of economy and model for economic behaviour, how can we even start to think of taking back the economy so that concern for well-being for ourselves, for others, for Earth others, is centre stage? The dominant representation, there he is, of capitalism is so dominant with its encompassing power, its generalisable dynamics, its enlarged spaces of agency. So communities in the face of this can only cower in its present. And this is where then the reframing is a technique of thinking and remaking the world, and where this reframing technique comes in. To reframe is to change our understanding, to refocus on different things, perhaps to foreground something that has been in the background. And as this slide shows, the familiar figured round shift between seeing either two faces looking at each other or a flower vase, depending on the frame of reference, should give you a sense of what reframing can do, how one's perspective can shift. For me, the most important reframing to have occurred in the last 100 or so years has been one brought about by the feminist movement. So feminism produced a different discourse of what it is and was to be a woman. Feminism has brought to light all the hidden histories, or her stories, of who holds up half the world. Feminism liberated women to take up many different roles, and it prompted a very different way of thinking about the world, one that put care and life and interconnection centre stage. So in my work with Julie, the reframing offered by feminism has informed our rethinking of the economy. We took inspiration from that incredibly revolutionary movement to try and rethink economy. The feminist message is a hopeful one. It takes, I think, a step beyond the Marxist adage that we understand the world in order to change it. It tells us that changing our understanding is to change the world, if only partially and locally. when we represent the economy not as a machine-like entity, but as the outcome of everyday human actions, we're able to map out many ways that new practices of economy are emerging and can be strengthened. So in Take Back the Economy, we challenge the identity of the economy as inevitably capitalist and take back the economy for people and the planet by focusing on the ethical decisions that inform multiple economic dynamics. Each chapter takes a mainstream economic term, like work, business, markets, property, finance, and takes it back by reframing it as a space of ethical decision, reclaiming it for a community economy, not a capitalist economy. And when we think about building a community economy, we don't put forward any one paradigm or one-size-fits-all approach. We have to approach each attempt to reclaim the economy for people and the planet with an open and a curious mind, a feeling heart and an orientation towards the experimental rather than the programmatic. And our task is really to gather together all the different emergent becomings that are out there, and not to rush, I think, too quickly to the bigger picture and the critical judgments. Not to say that we don't need critical perspectives, but we also need to appreciate and amplify what's already going on. So, is there a way of approaching the challenges that face us so that we're not led into thinking that there is a one true and better pathway forward? I think, thinking about alternative economies in the past has always been kind of led by one particular trajectory, whether it was socialism or communism or social democracy. And I guess we're trying to diversify those pathways. So if the economy is not represented as a machine that operates in a predictable way, with economists pulling levers to control money supply or labour markets, then we can't set a course and expect that things will systematically unfold. And if our Earth is not a bottomless resource pit, we can't keep feeding it to a machine to be gobbled up and spewed out. We've got to find other metaphors, other frames of meaning that inspire new ways of being and acting. And this is where the diverse economy reframing comes in. It widens the scope of what makes up our economy, that is the identity of the economy. It reframes economic identity and opens up the discussion of what economic dynamics are and what we might want to activate as subjects within that economy. So it reframes also economic dynamics. In our work with communities interested in different life-affirming development pathways, we've used this image of the iceberg economy to help people to see that they are all contributing to an economy that meets material needs and distributes wealth and well-being. Above the waterline, we see the activities that are usually recognised as being part of the real economy. So here we have producing commodities for markets, working as wage labourers in capitalist businesses. And below the waterline, we see a whole chaotic mix of activities that are also necessary for survival that produce well-being. Work in the home, in the neighbourhood, production for use, not for exchange, other kinds of enterprises like cooperatives or social enterprises. So this image produces a kind of figure ground shift for many people who see themselves now not as excluded from the economy but contributing to an economy, whereas before they sell themselves as somewhat marginal or unemployed or retrenched or doing home duties that aren't part of what is a functioning economy. And this image has been used in many different contexts and transposed into different objects. So this is just an image, not in Spanish, I'm sorry, of the floating coconut. That was the way we represented the economy and action research in Melanesia, where very few people are engaged in the formal economy. And on the left-hand side, you see all the different activities that are actually keeping people alive. And in this research, we were trying to focus on the gendered nature of the economy. So we're looking at the kinds of activities that women and men participated in. So the diverse economy widens the scope of what makes up our economy, and here it draws, of course, on a whole lot of other research in anthropology, in informal sector studies, in economic sociology, in development studies, in community cooperative movement studies, community activism, and so on. It gathers this heterogeneous range of economic activities that have been studied in other contexts and arrays them in a more systematic framework, rather than the jumble of activities in the iceberg. So I'm moving on now to a more systematic vision of the diverse economy. So activities are arranged into columns, each pertaining to different kinds of practices. So along with mainstream economic activities of waged employment, formal markets and capitalist enterprise, the diverse economy framing includes other forms of labour, other forms of transaction, other forms of enterprise, including those in which relations are non-monetised or are motivated by concerns that can't be reduced to the rational competitive self-interest of the entrepreneurial subject. So, for instance, if we take labour, we have wage labour, but we also have all different alternative forms of labour that is paid, either in kind or through reciprocity or through some sort of state payment for some kind of work. And we have all the work that is performed outside of a market transaction that is unpaid: housework, family work, volunteer work, and so on. Slave labour, another form. So in marshalling together the work that goes into a diverse economy, we're not trying to focus on all the things that we think are good. We're just arraying all the different specificities, all the different kinds of work or labour that is produced and is performed. When it comes to thinking about transactions, we can include then, apart from just formal labour, formal markets, many kinds of alternative markets, fair trade markets, for instance, and then also the other sorts of transactions that aren't monetised or that are taking place in other contexts, such as transactions with with the earth or with the environment, or transactions through barter and so on. And when we think about business or enterprise, we can start to think about all sorts of businesses that might have a capitalist appearance, but also distribute surplus in interesting ways and away from just private accumulation. And we could think here of state enterprises, although many of them are very commandeered to a kind of capitalist rationale, but also social enterprises. And then non-capitalist enterprises such as worker-owned cooperatives, feudal enterprises, social enterprises, and so on. Same thing if we start to think about property. We can think about the classic private property, but then alternative forms of private property such as clan ownership or these kinds of more communitarian forms of legally kind of negotiated ownership, and also the kind of open access resources in which property relations are really unspecified but become then the site of a lot of struggle over ownership. And same thing with finance. We can think about not just mainstream finance that is meted out by banks and financial institutions, but the alternative financial institutions such as credit unions and all the other kinds of non-marketised ways that investment is marshalled and shared by people. So this is a kind of an inventory, a very different way of starting to approach the economy through practices, through identifying specific practices and their dynamics. And we can use this kind of framework to understand economies in place and start to document the incredible variety of relationships and practices that make up an economy or the ways in which people survive in place. This is just taking the category of alternative labour and alternative forms of paid labour, and here this is the set of terms that or some of the terms that are used in the Philippines, in a particular area I've worked in, where very different relationships around labour have their own name, have their own ethic, have their own calculative frame. Whether you're working on someone's other rice field in a form of reciprocal labour exchange, whether you're helping unpick the the fish from the fishing net and have access to those that have been stuck, or have it's a way of distributing goods and services to poorer people who come and help with the harvest or with the fish catch. So we start to look at the incredible productivity of practices that fly under the radar when we start to just look at the economy as a machine. Here are the forms of voluntary labour that go into surviving well in communities, helping around various life courses, also shared communal labour for cleaning and garbage garbage management and so on. We can look at transactions, particularly the ways in which communities share resources around funerals and weddings, having small savings groups that allow them for these major life events to be performed, especially by poor people. And then all the different ways that credit is circulating under different kind of conditions and law and rules and regulations and ethics. So just to take that diverse economy in place, you start to have this incredible proliferation of terms that many of them are still practiced. They're not just something that was in the past, and they are something we have to work with in terms of thinking about what an economy is and how it might develop differently. So how does, though, the reframing of economy as diverse help towards building different futures? The capitalist growth machine, in this growth machine, development is framed in terms of these trajectories of growth. People getting higher wages, companies making more profits, goods getting cheaper, privatisation taking over, unregulated gambling of finances. These are the kind of things that are seen as common sense. That's what economic development is. So in the face of that, can we take back the economy and work towards a different future? Can we start to think about different ethics, like how do we survive well? How might we distribute surplus in different ways? How might we encounter others in transactions ethically? How might we common the resources that we need to live well? How might we invest in futures? How might we consume sustainably? So when we start to ask these more ethical questions, we come back and look at the diverse economy in a new light. So rather than looking at all the ways we work and just trying to document the different labours, we might ask ourselves, what forms of work, what mix of types of work contribute to a good life? Why is it that we're, this whole work-life balancing, we're all working so hard to get the money to buy the commodities that are then ruining our world? Let's start to come back to basics and say, what kinds of work and labour do we want to perform? And what kind of mix of forms of labour would actually produce a better form of living? When we think about enterprise, we might look at the ways in which surplus is created and distributed within different enterprise frames, and think about which are the ones that are going to be able to create a more socially just future. When we think about encounters or transactions, we might start to think of them more in terms of encounter. How do we actually start to care for the other at the end of that transaction? And what ways might we start to bring that encounter to visibility rather than keeping it in the shadows at an arm's length? When we're thinking about property and property relations, we could start to think of the ways in which private property and all forms of property could be commoned for a community or for a greater good. And similarly, when we think about investment, we could start to say, well, why do we invest? Why do we even save? It's really to have a future. So let's think about the forms of the mechanisms by which we can invest and the frameworks in which we can do it that will ensure a sustainable or a just future. So these are the kind of ethical questions that we're interested in putting forward as something that it goes beyond, well, is part of this reframing of economy, because it's those ethical relationships that could produce a different kind of dynamic. Not the dynamics of supply and demand that seem so mechanical, but dynamics that are based in ethical principles. So unlike that structurally configured economy, where with its regularities and its lawful relationships, the community economy is an acknowledged space of social interdependency and self-formation, social and ecological interdependency, and that centres on these kinds of concerns. And I think there's a lot of ways of interpreting these concerns, and I think there's a lot of intersections perhaps with what Arturo is going to talk about after, about how these kinds of concerns are configured in different contexts. So just a quote from a post-capitalist politics: anything but a blueprint. The community economy is an unmapped and uncertain terrain that calls forth exploratory conversations and political and ethical acts of decision. Really, they are political acts. So what I've done up till now then is introduce this reframing of economy, and then the kind of ways in which we might start to not just reframe economic identity and what constitutes the economy, but also start to reframe what constitutes the dynamics that might motivate that economy. And now I want to quickly go on to some of the tools that we've developed that we can use to work together to focus in on these kinds of ethical negotiations and think about possibilities. So the kinds of tools are very simple ones that we've developed, and some of them are pictured here. All of them really are just devices to start to think of what are we negotiating around and about, and how might we use these tools to make more explicit the kinds of negotiations and who's involved in those negotiations that will be needed to start to build ethical economies. So tell me how much more time I've got, because I've got a few. I can go on and illustrate. What's that? Okay. Great. So let's go on to thinking about reframing work and labour, and to focus on surviving well. And here we're wanting to think about not just surviving well individually, surviving well with our family and our community, but also surviving well with the earth, with the planet. And what we need to think about is how are we trading off different survival needs, those of our own, those of others, those of the earth. Well, the first step is to do a kind of simple time use analysis and assemble what has been done, or what do we do in the hours of the day, and classify this labour in terms of the diverse kinds of work performed. So, for instance, this is a 24-hour clock, and here we've documented the work of an Australian miner who's working a 12-hour shift. So he's working 12 hours at the mine, usually in a big machine, air-conditioned machine, earning a huge amount of money, certainly way beyond what university professors earn. He has a certain number of hours of rest, quite a few numbers of hours of travel, and a little bit of recreation. This is the kind of work that is paid, as I said, at quite exorbitant rates. I suppose it's the kind of money that's needed to get people to be allied or advise their allegiance to the fossil fuel industry. It's the kind of life that research, including my own research, has shown increasingly leads to ill health, to family breakdown, and to the breakdown of the mining towns that people have lived in, the very dysfunctional places, especially since 12-hour shifts have been introduced, and many miners now bus in and bus out, or fly in and fly out, and work these 12-hour shifts for a sequence of days, and then fly back to the coast. So there are many people they're taking the money at the expense of other parts of their life, particularly their family life. By contrast then, or another type of work, here's the work of a small farmer in the Philippines, another area I've done research. And here we have a mix of labour practices in a 24-hour clock. This Danilo, we'll call him a peasant farmer, is a tenant farmer, so he works both for in-kind payments, a proportion of the rice harvest every year. He also does some labouring at the port for money, so he's a paid labourer. He also does reciprocal labour among other farmers in order to help out. And then he does volunteer labour in the community and has time for rest and recreation. So these are the kind of very different patterns. If we were to look at our own 24-hour clocks, we'd probably find that most academics' 24-hour clock resembles pretty much the Australian miner. And who knows what students' 24-hour clocks might be. They're probably piecing together many different forms of work in order to survive. It's interesting to share this with each other, to actually look at what we're doing and then to think about the kind of well-being that this creates. So here we can use a pretty classic well-being index to measure up our own human survival. How is it going in terms of material wealth or material well-being, occupational well-being, social well-being, community well-being, and physical well-being. And interestingly, when many people have done these exercises, they all ask, well, why haven't we got spiritual well-being in there as well? So I think if we were to do another version of the book, we should add that in. So here we can start to see, what are we balancing up? How much are we balancing up work for money versus work for life? And where is this happening? Where is it coming out for us as individuals? And then we could start to think about our own families, our own communities. So we're using this kind of well-being scorecard, for instance, for our poor farmer in the Philippines. We could see that while materially he is getting a score of 1, which is not very good, maybe, his personal well-being is supported by other things, by a rich community life and a social support network. So this exercise, though, isn't only focused on human well-being. And in our kind of clunky way, we've asked, well, what about the ecological well-being of these two contrasting work lifestyles? So to look at our interdependence, then, with Earth Others, we can use this ecological footprint calculator to gauge how non-human surviving well is going in association with these different kinds of working lives. And this is just one way of trying to measure up the impact of different kinds of lives on the environment. So we could calculate, for instance, the ecological footprint of each work lifestyle and expand or contract the size of the circle representing the working day according to the ecological impact, according to how many planets would be needed if everybody lived like Danilo, or if everyone lived like our Australian miner. So you'll see that the lifestyle of the Filipino farmer is really working within the planetary limits, whereas the lifestyle of the Australian miner is, would require something like 3.5 planets if everybody lived like that. One of the things that the miners in this particular context do is consume a lot of machinery, usually many cars, trucks and boats, as a kind of, they buy these things as a way of kind of assuaging, I think, the pain of working at that pace and in those environments. So the consumption expenditure that goes along with that income is quite large. So when we match these two modes of surviving with their ecological footprint, we can see that the Australian miner is drawing down the Earth's resources at an unsustainable rate, while the Philippines farmer is living within the planet's ecological means, if we go along with the kind of calculations that kind of device allows for. And this is just one way of starting then to put these connections together. What kind of lives are we living? What kind of impact is that having? What is it doing to our environment? And here is a picture of some women in Colombia on the plains of Bogotá at Madrid. They're they've been working in the flower industry, the cut flower industry there. You can see the hothouses where they've been working, which is very taxing on the body. They work in very hot temperatures and then have to go into very cold temperatures, very moist environments, standing many hours of the day, moving in a very mechanical way. And many women, after a number of years, become quite ill in this kind of work. And many of them now are retired or trying to find other ways of livelihood, and some of them are their daughters who are not wanting to go into that kind of work. And here at Asociación Herrera, which is a feminist group that's kind of an educational and activist group, they're doing the 24-hour clock and starting to think about their survival, how they do survive, and how could they improve their survival. And it was quite a emotional exploration to do it together, because I think in our society we mainly live our lives on an individual level and don't necessarily share some of these quite quite hard decisions we're making in order to trade off different kinds of well-being. And this group is now doing interesting things in terms of trying to set up their own community organic farms and getting into different kinds of agriculture in this environment. So these kinds of exercises really can be done with every area of the economy. For instance, if we start to move on to transactions, we could start to look at, again, interrogate the products that we consume and start to think about where do they come from and what are the conditions under which they have been made. Starting to look at to what extent can we have ethical encounters with those at a distance that make the food and consumption items that we rely on a daily basis. So this is a kind of diverse economy dandelion that just takes a certain number of goods in the household and says, where do they come from? What do I know about the environment and the conditions under which they've been made? Here we take the simple tomato, all the different ways that we consume tomato, either fresh or in cans or dried, and try and track back the kinds of places that these tomatoes are coming from. And at that point one can start to say, well, what would be the most ethical way of consuming this particular fruit? To what extent could I forego eating tomatoes during the months that I can't grow them for myself or get them from my neighbours? Or to what extent is it useful to keep producing and consuming dried tomatoes that are being made by, for instance, enterprises in Italy that are recouped enterprises on land that's been taken back from the mafia, where communities are trying to develop new enterprises as a way of livelihood in certain parts of Italy. One can start to think about those transactions and take more ethical decisions. And again, it's probably something that's easier to do in a group rather than as an individual. And lastly, I'll just take the example of property. And I guess just going back to this, I think probably many of the groups here are involved in some kind of production of food or beverages in which they are trying to build ethical relationships with consumers and with each other. So there's a kind of way in which you're contributing to the development of, I guess, more opportunities for community economy transactions to occur, certainly in the food area. So lastly then, let me just look at property. And here, our interest is in the notion of commoning and how we might think about property as something that we approach and can access as a community that shares the benefit of different kinds of property. So one technique here, we actually given someone who was you studied in Lund, where Hagerstrand was, we took the old time geography framework and said, let's look at people moving through their 24-hour day and let's look at the kinds of property relations, the kinds of ownership relations of the spaces that they move through. And here we've taken an example of Bill, a miner, and his wife Sue, who's a nurse, who live in a company-owned house. Bill goes to work in a privately owned mine. Sue goes to work in a publicly owned hospital. They then often go to the community centre that's a community-owned venue. And they, as through their day, they move through different kinds of property relations. Then we can say, well, to what extent are those places, those properties, common? And what do we mean then by commons? And as you see, the kinds of property they've moved through is individually owned private property, including family property, corporate property, individually owned property. They also move through collectively owned private property, like the community centre, state-owned property, like the hospital, and open access property, both managed and unmanaged. They're obviously having to interact with atmospheres and so on. But if you start to look at their day, we could see that they might be having a relationship to that property that is common. So the common identity kit is another way of looking at our relationship to property. To what extent do we have access? Do we negotiate use? Do we share the benefit? do we take responsibility and care for property? And our vision is to see that these kinds of practices of commoning, care, use, benefit, responsibility and so on, can be performed around different kinds of ownership. So if we look at the kinds of property that Bill and Sue move between, we can see that some of them are common. For instance, the primary school, which is a state-owned property, but mostly the community of parents and children play an active role in taking care of that space, taking responsibility for the resources it has, for how it's cleaned, how behaviour is monitored and so on. The football club that Bill goes to is also a common space where people volunteer to take over serving at the bar and so on. The community centre is another common space, and Sue does a lot of work with photo montages as part of her hobby. She uses Wikipedia, which is another form of commoning of intellectual property. So you can see here different kinds of property relationships in terms of ownership are being negotiated through rules and practices of a community that's commoning. So this is again something we could interrogate in our own lives. What are the spaces that we are involved in that we feel part of a community that commons, and what are the spaces that aren't, and why is that the case? To what extent is our university, for instance, a common space or not? Okay. And here we can think of the different ways of commoning. You can either common enclosed properties, for instance, like a privately owned university. One can take back that space to some extent as a commons or not. One can start to create new commons, or one can start to manage open access resources in a way that as a commons. So a commons is a property, a practice or a knowledge that is shared by a community, and the bounds of that community are going to always have to be negotiated. But clearly our survival depends on many different kinds of commons: biophysical, cultural, social and knowledge commons. And they're continually being made and unmade, drawn down and replenished, maintained or degraded. And just starting to get a kind of categorisation of that in one's own life and one's own country starts to gives us options, I think, or at least starts to focus on where action might take place to increase a sense of that a community economy is possible. So, as I said, the question of who actually owns a commons is open. A commons can be created, I think, with many different kinds of property. And here I think there's been a bit of a different history of this concept where people have mainly focused on commons having to be not privately owned, and there's been a kind of focus on ownership rather than a focus on the practice and rules of commoning, which we're more interested in focusing on. So what we ask in Take Back the Economy is that we could start to record our relationships to commons, and not just in the present, but also over a longer time period that starts to place our present in the kind of temporal context that certainly climate change asks us to consider. And many of us can perhaps remember our grandparents and the stories that they might have told about their life and the life of their parents. So many of us have a sense in which we can imagine back 3 generations. And we're thinking about a different device, which is the Commons Yardstick, where we ask people to imagine forward, not just 3 generations, but 7 generations. And this is a kind of tool, the Commons Yardstick, which has been inspired by, many Indigenous cosmologies, where any action in the present is always thought of in terms of many generations hence, and is also put in the context of what has gone before. We moderns, I think, find it very hard to do that, and when we start to do that, we can start to see the very complex history of commoning and uncommoning that our privilege is based upon. So this Commons Yardstick is a way of starting to map this out, and here in the book we talk about the ways in which there have been attempts to common the atmosphere. Certainly the uncommoning of it started many centuries ago, but accelerated with industrialisation and the way in which pollution was pumped out into the atmosphere. And there's been many attempts at different times to start to care for the atmosphere. The Clean Air Acts in the 1950s in England that then spread all around the world to try and reduce the amount of pollutants coming from fire burning and so on was one attempt. The Montreal Protocol has been another to try and control the damage to the ozone layer, which is one of the few kind of successes at a global scale of some kind of global commoning. And of course now we're really struggling with the idea of how to deal with climate change as a global community. So this commons yardstick we could do not just for atmosphere, we could do for any kind of thing like the parks in the city or other resources like state schools and so on. To what extent there's been moments in history when hospitals and schools were actually owned and commoned by communities versus kind of run in a very bureaucratic way where community is locked out. And I'll just end with one example of some commoning that has been going on recently in the last few years in Paris that I've had quite a bit to do with. And I think it illustrates the ongoing need to be very vigilant around the kinds of politics that emerge in the commoning space. This is a wonderful project called the Rural Urban, started by some architects and the community in Cologne, which is on the outskirts of Paris, a quite multicultural immigrant community. And there the council allowed access to this rather destitute space, and over time a wonderful community garden was built and a community centre to try and model what a city could be in the future, how we can start to create more food resources but also more senses of community. Because as you see, the big towers behind the site are public housing for many different people who don't have access to this kind of space, but this Agro-City was has become a community hub. And it's a case of commoning. There's been privately owned land or state-owned or the council's land given access to a community of commoners who then built this up. As part of this project, there was also an attempt to take back roads and say, well, in the future, hopefully, we won't have so many cars filling up roads. Let's try and imagine a city where roads could be half taken over by the community. And here is a road that was they were given access to build a recycling laboratory, which had space for a designer to live in and a worker space to be used by the local community. And this project has had a lot of publicity and a lot of support and a lot of joy has come out of it. But a change of government at the local municipal level, and that a few years ago when many of the municipalities in France went to the right, a new mayor came in who decided they wanted to take it back and build a car park, which wasn't needed really, but her husband was a property investor and she had an interesting kind of strategy for helping his business interests. So this garnered much response and from all over the world. There was a great paper and an article in The Guardian about it. And despite all the architectural and design prizes this whole thing has got, it wasn't successful, and now it is a car park. So what's interesting though is the whole infrastructure was built in order to be taken down within 24 hours. So you can see these containers, and the whole building was designed to be undone or deconstructed, as your daughter said. Yes, in that kind of understanding of deconstruction. So it's now stored and it's going to be moved to another municipality, and many other municipalities around Paris have actually asked for this kind of development to occur. So one could see this as a failure, a struggle that failed in this site, but in a kind of transversal politics, a politics of drift, we might say, having heard the paper at the other conference. It's actually spreading all around, and this kind of form of commoning and community building is becoming much more accepted in Paris. So just to end then, the community economy is not a space that isn't associated with struggle. It isn't a space that's not that's not full of politics. It's full of negotiations. But how do we start to put these kinds of politics at an everyday level on the agenda? Our book is really trying to help produce thinking strategies, techniques, bringing things to visibility. The idea is to first diversify the economy, see the huge range of heterogeneous economic practices that we have at hand, then start to think about where are those ethical relationships that we want to build that will produce another world. What are the forms of interdependency that we can recognise, bring to visibility and strengthen in a way that is just and ecologically responsible? And then what are the kinds of collective actions that we can join together in to build these kinds of economies, and what are the struggles that we'll need to face as we do so? I think I'm interested in using these tools. These are different kinds of models. They're not really models, they're different kinds of techniques, although maybe it would be fun at one point to sit down with people and try and model a machine that has water flowing in and out of it and spraying out to community gardens, and in the way that the Moniac model does. A different kind of way of conceptualising community economies operating in this punctiform way across the world. But economies that will allow a different kind of common sense to be enacted, to come into being. Not that common sense that sees us all as only ever people wanting higher wages and lower priced goods and more money and more investment. There's many other economic subjectivities that we can occupy, and this kind of work, I think, helps to start to bring those to the fore and starts to help develop them. A set of practical tools, really, for developing a different kind of common sense about what it is to live together on this earth. So our manual, or our pedagogy for building community economies, is, we hope, a contribution to enacting new worlds. Thank you.